No one noticed when Aiden stopped laughing. Not at the dinner table, not at school, not even during the summer storms he used to love, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning like it was a game. Something faded the day he turned 15, something too quiet to alarm anyone who wasn't listening. But Aiden had always known how to hide things well, especially from the man who raised him. After the divorce, after his mother disappeared into a new life across the country, Aiden was sent to live with his grandfather, a man who still ironed his socks and lined up his war medals every Sunday like clockwork. Grandpa Everett was rigid, the kind of man who believed silence was strength, and that any softness in a boy was something to beat out before it grew roots. Aiden didn't rebel. He didn't shout. He wrote, each night, under the soft yellow light of a borrowed lamp. Aiden filled the pages of a plain leather-bound journal with everything he couldn't say aloud. The ink carried his secrets, his fears, his aching questions about identity, about why he felt drawn to boys when everyone around him made that feel like a curse. But he didn't write in plain English. No, Aiden developed a personal code, symbols only he could understand, twisting language into safety. It was his way of surviving in a house that mistook love for control. Everett knew Aiden wrote, of course. He mocked it, called it girls' business again. When he caught a glimpse of the journal spine sticking out from under Aiden's pillow, Aiden learned to be more careful after that. He hid the book in his backpack, zipped up inside a math textbook he never opened. He never imagined the old man would dig through his things. But one day, he came home early from school, opened the door quietly, and saw it, his journal, in Grandpa Everett's hands. The old man sat in his recliner like a judge on the bench, his reading glasses perched low, his mouth curled with contempt. He hadn't deciphered the code, not yet, but that didn't matter. He had seen enough. Symbols, initials, pages filled with patterns that hinted at a truth he refused to face. He didn't yell. He didn't ask questions. He only said one word. Cold and slow, sinful. Aiden didn't speak. He stood there, frozen, watching years of safety vanish in seconds. The journal slipped from Everett's hand and hit the floor. And just like that, a boundary was broken. No apology, no explanation. Just that one word, echoing like a verdict. That night, Aiden didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how many people like his grandfather walk this earth thinking they love their children while slowly erasing them from the inside out. By morning, Aiden had made his decision. He packed his things in silence, one backpack, one change of clothes, a handful of saved cash, and his journal or what was left of it. Most pages had been torn out, destroyed, but one remained. He sat at the kitchen table before sunrise and wrote something new. Carefully, deliberately, in the same code, but this time layered. This page wasn't just his goodbye. It was a message, one that wouldn't be understood unless someone wanted to understand. He folded it and left it on the kitchen counter. Then he walked out the door, not knowing where he would go, but certain of one thing: he would never again stay in a place that called his heart a crime. Aiden disappeared that morning, and for months, Grandpa Everett told the neighbors the boy had gone off to figure himself out. What he didn't say was that every night since, he pulled out that final page and stared at it under the dim light of his study, unable to sleep, unable to crack it, haunted not just by what it might say, but by the terrifying thought that it might be about him. If you've ever had to leave a place to become who you really are, you're not alone. For more stories that speak from the heart, follow Heartstories. The house had never felt emptier. Grandpa Everett still rose at 5 every morning, boiled the same bitter coffee, folded the same newspaper, polished the same boots he hadn't worn in decades. But the silence now was different. It wasn't peace. It was the echo of something broken, something gone. Aiden's absence should have been temporary. That's what Everett told himself. And anyone who asked, teenagers run away. They come back. The world out there is cold, unforgiving. A boy like that wouldn't last long. But the weeks dragged on. then months, and Aiden stayed gone. Everett never told anyone the truth. Not about the journal, not about the word he'd used. He kept that shame locked behind clenched teeth and heavy footsteps. Yet each night he returned to the folded page Aiden had left behind. Still coded, still unreadable, and yet it stared back at him like a mirror. In the beginning, Everett kept it tucked under a stack of old military documents, medals, discharge forms, yellowing letters from an era when men didn't speak of feelings. But over time, the page rose closer to the top. Eventually, it found its way onto the desk, unfolded, flattened, waiting. He didn't ask for help, not at first. The pride ran too deep, carved into him by war, by the church, by the long line of fathers who taught their sons to stand tall and speak little. But one sleepless night, curiosity outweighed his armor. He reached out to an old friend, Charles, a retired cryptography professor who once worked for naval intelligence. Everett framed it as a favor. Something strange the boy left. He said. Charles agreed to take a look, more out of politeness than expectation. But 2 weeks later, he called back, his voice unsettled, the way someone speaks when they realize they've read something they shouldn't have. He didn't say much, just that the code was complex, that it wasn't gibberish, that it hid a message Everett might not be ready for. Everett dismissed him. Pride again. He folded the page and shoved it back in his drawer, but the words lingered. Not the decoded ones, just the warning of you might not be ready. That was when the nightmares began. He started dreaming of someone from a time he thought he'd buried. A man with a crooked smile, calloused hands, and eyes that once made him feel seen. They had served together Vietnam, 1968. Everett was 19. The other man, Levi, had been 22. Clever, quiet, and endlessly kind. In a world full of fire and death, Levi was a rare silence. They had shared cigarettes, blankets, one drunken confession under a makeshift tarp while mortars lit the sky behind them. But it wasn't love. At least that's what Everett told himself for 50 years. Love was a luxury. This was war. And afterward, Levi had disappeared from his life like all fragile things eventually do. Except now he was back. Not in person, in memory, in guilt, in whatever Aiden had somehow unearthed and encoded on that last page. Everett began searching through the boxes he kept in the attic, things untouched for decades. He found an old shoebox filled with letters, some unopened. One, already yellowed, was postmarked 1971. The handwriting was unmistakable. Levi. Everett had never opened it. He didn't need to. He'd already made the decision long ago silence was safer. But now he did, and inside was a confession, not of guilt, but of love. Levi had written, I know what we were. Even if you don't say it, I do. I'll carry it, even if you won't. Everett folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. For the first time in years, his throat tightened not from age, but from emotion. A name he had refused to say aloud now burned behind his eyes. Levi. Aiden had known. Somehow, impossibly, the boy had found the letter. Or maybe he had simply sensed it. The way people who've been denied love recognize the absence of it in others. Everett had tried to erase what had once made him human, and now he had done the same to his grandson. The journal page, that final coded entry, wasn't a goodbye. It was a reflection, a reminder that what Everett had once buried out of fear, Aiden had dared to live out loud. And for that, Everett had called him sinful. The page wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to be felt. And finally, most Everett did. The letter stayed on the table for days, unfolded, exposed. Everett didn't move it, couldn't. Every time he walked past, the words echoed louder than memory. He had lived most of his life as a statue, rigid, unmoved, unmoving. But now the surface was cracking. What once was buried under uniform creases and old war stories was beginning to breathe again. It was the silence afterward that hurt the most. Not from Levi, whose voice now only lived in faded ink, but from Aiden, The boy had disappeared into a world Everett didn't know how to reach. The phone never rang. The mailbox never sang his name. And in the stillness of each passing day, Everett began to understand what true absence meant, not as punishment, but as consequence. The ache was not unfamiliar. It mirrored what he had once felt after Levi was gone. That same cold emptiness between ribs, the same sense of something irreplaceable having slipped through his fingers because he refused to name it when he had the chance. Everett tried to distract himself with routines, fixing the same drawer that always stuck, cleaning tools he never used, but the silence remained, and the page from Aiden's journal remained beside Levi's letter, two pieces of a story Everett had spent a lifetime pretending wasn't his. Weeks passed before he built the courage to search, not with police, not with neighbors, but through the only clue Aiden had ever truly left the journal. Everett hadn't thrown it away. The damaged cover still held the scent of ink and dust. Most of the pages were missing, but a few fragments remained symbols and slashes, the secret language of a mouse trying to protect something no one else had cared enough to see. Everett began decoding what he could. He returned to Charles, asked him to help with the remaining scraps. Bit by bit, a shape began to form. Not a map, not an address, but a series of names, each marked with small symbols, a heart, a question mark, a single star. Charles speculated they were people, friends, maybe places Aiden had visited or dreamed of. It was one name in particular that pulled Everett's breath short. Lighthouse Collective. Aiden had marked it with both a heart and a star. It sounded like a shelter, maybe a community. Everett wasn't sure, but he found a number online buried beneath a page for LGBTQ+ youth outreach. He called, unsure what to expect. The voice that answered was kind, steady. He asked for Aiden. They said no one there went by that name, but he could leave a message if he wished. He didn't. Instead, he drove. The building sat on the edge of town, tucked behind a line of trees and wind-worn fences. It was modest white paint chipping, garden beds dry from summer heat. But it breathed. It felt lived in, alive in a way Everett's house hadn't felt in years. He stood outside the gate for a long time, unsure whether he had the right, whether forgiveness could even begin here. A woman eventually approached. She looked to be in her 30s, tattoos half hidden beneath sleeves, eyes gentle but sharp. She asked if he needed help. Everett nodded once, just enough to keep from falling apart. He asked again for Aiden. Again. She said no one by that name. But then she paused. There was someone, she said, who had arrived a few months back. Quiet, kept to himself, wrote in journals, loved puzzles, went by a different name now, chose it himself. She didn't reveal it, said it wasn't hers to share, but she saw something in Everett's eyes, something fragile, aching, and too long denied. So she offered a compromise. She handed him an envelope, not from the bomb, but from the house itself, something found in a donation box left by a resident who had since moved on. It was addressed only to someone who finally wants to listen. Everett opened it there on the porch, with the woman watching quietly from a distance. Inside was a single page, Aiden's handwriting. No code, no symbols, just words. The page trembled slightly in Everett's hand. Though the air was still and dry, the handwriting was unmistakable, neat, deliberate, shaped by a boy who had learned to write carefully in a world that had not been careful with him. Aiden's pen strokes were no longer coded, no longer hidden behind layers of protection. The truth now lived in plain language. And Everett, for the first time, allowed himself to read without defense. The letter didn't begin with anger. It didn't accuse Aiden. It didn't even mention the word that had cracked the foundation between them. Instead, it began with a single sentence some silences are too loud to live with. Aiden wrote of absence, not just the kind that comes when someone leaves, but the kind that grows when someone stays yet refuses to see you. He described what it felt like to be invisible inside his own home, to walk through rooms and hold his breath, waiting for a moment when it might be safe to exist fully, He wrote about the weight of hiding, the exhaustion of pretending, and the loneliness that came not from being alone, but from being unwanted exactly as he was. He didn't blame Everett outright. He acknowledged the war, the time, the generation built on survival in silence. But he also named the harm, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but settles in the bones. The kind that teaches a child to flinch at their own reflection. He spoke of the day Everett found his journal, not with bitterness, but clarity. He had expected disappointment. He had prepared for anger. What he hadn't expected was contempt. That word sinful had carved itself into his chest more deeply than any punishment ever could, because it didn't just judge what he did, it condemned who he was. And yet, Aiden's letter was not a reckoning. It was an invitation. He wrote of the letter he'd found, Levi's letter, and the quiet storm it had stirred inside him. He hadn't meant to find it. He had been searching for a flashlight during a power outage and stumbled upon a box buried beneath blankets in the attic. Curiosity had led him further, and when he read the postmark, he knew it was not meant for his eyes, but something told him it held more than just memories. It held truth. Aiden never judged Everett for what was in that letter. In fact, he wrote that it was the first time he had felt connected to the man who raised him, not through discipline or rules or shared blood, but through the ache of suppressed love. He wrote, "I know now why you feared my journal. It wasn't because of what I wrote, it was because it reminded you of what you never got to say." Aiden described how that realization softened the rage he had carried. It didn't erase the pain, but it turned the wound into a window. He left not out of hatred, but because he needed air, space, a chance to write without fear of being read by someone who would not understand. The letter ended not with a plea to return, but with a request to reflect. "You don't need to come find me," he wrote, "but if you ever do, come as someone willing to tell their story, not just demand mine. I don't need you to be proud. I just need you to be honest." As Everett finished the letter, he realized his hands were shaking. The woman on the porch didn't speak. She simply gave him a knowing nod before stepping back inside. He sat there for a long while, the envelope resting on his knee, the page still open in his lap. For the first time in his long life, Everett didn't know what came next. There were no orders, no structure, no rules to follow. Only this quiet, aching space left by the grandson he had lost not to death, but to silence. And in that stillness, Everett didn't feel like a soldier, or a man who had won medals, or a grandfather upholding values. He felt like someone standing at the edge of a truth he had run from all his life. The days that followed were quiet in a different way. Not the silence of denial or shame, but the stillness that comes when someone finally lays a heavy truth down and decides to stop running. Everett no longer reached for the newspaper each morning. He no longer folded socks with surgical precision. Instead, he returned to the attic, to the past he had boxed away in layers of dust and silence. He read every letter Levi had sent, even the ones he'd never opened. Some were tender, others were confused. One spoke of fear, another hope. But the thread that tied them all together was love, the kind that was never given air, never offered a name, and never allowed to become more than memory. Everett realized he had carried that absence like a medal, convinced that sacrificing his truth was a form of duty. And now he had passed that weight down to someone who never asked for it. It took him a week to return to the Lighthouse Collective. This time, he didn't ask to see Aiden. He didn't beg for forgiveness or demand a second chance. He brought only one thing: a journal, new, unopened, with a soft leather cover. Inside, on the first page, he wrote only one sentence: "I never wrote mine. Maybe now. I will." He asked the woman who had given him Aiden's letter if she would keep it safe. Not for the boy, for the man Everett had never been brave enough to become. She accepted it, gently. He turned to leave, but before he stepped off the porch, she called out, said someone had dropped off something else that morning. No name attached, just a box. Inside were pages, fragments from a journal, worn and marked. still in Aiden's familiar script. At the very top was a note, short, uncoded. For him, he might be ready now. Everett didn't open it right away. He waited until he got home, placed the ball on the same desk where Levi's letters once sat, and breathed in the quiet. Then, slowly, he began to read. There was poetry, observations, lists of things Aiden loved: sunlight on wooden floors, the way music feels in the chest, the smell of old books, boys who smile with their eyes. There were pages written in anger, confusion, joy, fear. But the final page, one that seemed written just days ago, held something unexpected. It wasn't addressed to Everett. It was a letter to someone else. To the version of myself I thought I had to destroy to survive. Aiden wrote of freedom, of how it took leaving to learn how to breathe again. He wrote of people who didn't flinch when he said who he was, of nights spent laughing without apology, of waking up and no longer dreading his own reflection. But he also wrote of grief, not for himself, but for the boy he used to be, the one who waited for a grandfather's love and got silence, the one who wrote in code, not because he liked mystery, but because he feared punishment, the one who left not out of hate, but because hope had run out. Still, the final sentence of the journal wasn't bitter. It wasn't even set. It simply read, "I forgive you. Even if you never say it, I needed to say it for me." Everett read that line over and over, until the edges blurred. He hadn't known forgiveness could arrive without being earned, that someone could give it freely, just to be free. And in that moment, something long dormant in him shifted. He stood, reached for the coat he hadn't worn in years, and pinned a small rainbow badge to the lapel. He didn't do it for display. He did it so that when he looked in the mirror, he would remember the cost of silence and the courage it takes to speak. He stepped outside as autumn leaves curled across the path, and for the first time in decades, he didn't walk with stiffness or shame. He walked with weight, yes, but also with purpose. Some stories aren't told to change the past. They're told so the future doesn't repeat it. And have you ever said, "I forgive you not for them, but for you"? Follow Heartstories for more true stories that heal, reveal, and remind us silence is not where love lives.